Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome to our LinkedIn Live here with Mailshake. I am Jed Mahrle, previous director of sales over at Mailshake. Now I run practical prospecting. I'm here with Benny Rubin as well. Benny, what's going on, man? Excited to finally do
Hello,
this with you.
Jed. How you doing?
I'm good, man. We just had a long, in-depth talk about email deliverability before we jumped on this, so we're going to get
Yeah, the
into it even
secret
more.
stuff. Now we're going to tell people the not secret stuff. No, I'm just
Exactly. We're going to give it a couple more minutes for people to jump in. But as you guys are jumping in, let us know in the comments where you're calling in from. Let us know why you joined too. Like, are you dealing with any deliverability problems? What sort of things do you want to hear about? We're going to do Q&A towards the end to go over just any questions you'll have. So think about questions, put them in the chat. And Sky, I see your question. It will be recorded. I believe we're going to send that after, but I'll get you more details after this. Shoot me a message on LinkedIn. But Benny, do you want to get started?
Yo,
Jump in.
Bangalore, India. Geez, it must be late at night there.
If anyone's in Michigan, let me know. I always love seeing people in Michigan. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, someone lie to Jed and say he's in Michigan. You're in
Yeah,
Michigan.
make my day. Say you're in Royal Oak, Michigan, which is where I am. Okay, Chicago. Nice.
Nice. That's pretty close. Pretty close. Michael, are you actually in Chicago or like Chicagoland area? I'm always curious when people. San Diego, that's a beautiful spot. Cambridge, UK. Wow, staying up late. Well, not that late, I guess. It's like 7 p.m. or something. Cool. Wait, Tampa, Florida, Michigan. Yeah, we have some comedians in the group.
Interesting. Wyoming. Wow, all right.
I think I don't see the numbers of participants going up too quickly anymore. Should we jump into it?
Yeah, we got 86, still going up a little bit. I think we can get started. Then we got the recording that we can share as well.
Bears
Don't
beating the
like the
Lions.
joke about the Bears beating the Lions. We'll pretend that didn't happen.
Wait, Dad,
Yeah,
didn't
Benny.
you say that you weren't sensitive about anything? Weren't you just saying that a second ago? I think we found the one thing you're sensitive about.
I guess you're right. Yeah, maybe the Lions is like the one thing.
Cool. Okay, let's see. If we jump, this is your slide. We didn't do this
Yes.
one.
So we got a bunch of content to go through. If you came to this show through my LinkedIn or my post and you don't know Benny yet, by the way, I know you're going to do your introduction, Benny, but I want to give you my own personal shout out as well. I met Benny at SaaStr actually 2 years ago, or like a year and a half ago. Wicked smart dude. He's been doing the cold email game for years. He does deliverability. He understands it honestly better than anybody else I've talked to. So I'm really excited for y'all to hear from him today. If this is your first time, he's got really interesting insights, stuff that's outside of the basic deliverability tips that we tend to hear. And I know there's a lot of changes around deliverability, so it's going to be super fun. Going to learn a lot, and remember to add questions in the Q&A. Myself, I'm the founder of Practical Prospecting. I am the former director of sales at Mailshake, which this webinar is being hosted by. I do outbound sales advising, and I run a newsletter called Practical Prospecting. But Benny, I will pass it over to you.
Yeah, before we jump in, everyone go. If you don't subscribe to Practical Prospecting, you should, because it's exactly as it sounds. I heard some people already in the comments asking questions about things that Jed probably covers in the newsletter. So jump over there. Come on, he's only 15,000 subs. We can get him to 20,000. Just so as Jed said, I've been doing cold email professionally since around 2016, which might sound like the dark ages to a lot of people on this call. I believe Mailshake has been around for longer than that, right, Jed?
Yeah, right around 2015, so not too much longer. Yep.
Yeah, but still, that's a long time ago in cold email land. Before I did it professionally, and have done it for hundreds of companies, I did it for the companies that I was running myself. And this is Senders is my third business. My first one was a marketing services business that we did a lot of cold email for. And then my second business was a software platform that failed miserably. We just totally crashed and burned. But we also built up and got really great clients through cold emailing. So then when I turned my attention to doing things for other companies in my network, they're all like, "You're good at cold emailing, you should help with that." So that was the impetus of starting a cold email outbound agency or a practice associated with it. In 2016, there was a lot that was different from now, but all in all, a lot of it's really the same. What's different is the actual sending environment has changed a lot. It's a lot harder to get emails sent and delivered than it was before. What hasn't changed really is the things that Jed talks about in his newsletter and other folks, which is about being a human and trying to connect with someone else in a digital format like email, and doing it in such a way that sort of resonates. So today on this call, I'm going to try to focus on the things that haven't changed. And in the Q&A, we can talk about all the things that are sort of changing really rapidly, if that makes sense. So the topic of this conversation is reputation. And Jed saw me go through a few different iterations of like what I wanted to talk about and how I wanted to present it. I used to have it where it's 3 words, it's reputation, ratio, and rapport, and it was going to bounce between all these 3 terms. And I said, you know what? Reputation really is the thing that matters a ton. So what do you need to do to establish reputation, improve your reputation, maintain reputation? That's both on the email mechanics side of things, what is commonly called email deliverability or sendability, as well as the softer, more business practices, email text side of things. A lot of the things that Jed really, his advice is like spot on for. So Jed can definitely weigh in on that side when I get there. Reputations, it's kind of a big concept, but looked at it through various lenses, it can sort of give you a clear picture of what's required to succeed or take your cold email to the next level, or if you're at a very high level, to maintain it. So we're going to talk about things to enhance your reputation and things that can potentially damage your reputation and how it all fits together. That makes sense? Cool.
Let's do it.
So let's talk about what happens when an email is sent. Again, everything through the lens of reputation. First, your email service provider judges your reputation. It does this before it even sends the email. If you're Google or Microsoft, they determine if something's amiss in your email setup. If it's Google, they decide in that moment if they're going to let you send or suspend your email account. If it's Microsoft, they make a determination of what IP pool they're going to be sending your email from. This means that if they feel like you're doing something that will either bring poor reputation to their own infrastructure or to yourself, they make it harder for you to send. So they just, that's something that happens right off the bat. Then the recipient email service provider measures your sending reputation before delivering the email. Everyone knows what this looks like. It's a spam filtration system. They basically don't want to deliver things that shouldn't be delivered. So they kind of like are saying, does this look like anything that shouldn't be delivered? Does this look like something that might be spam or might be a scam? Is the sender who they say they are? That's what SPF, DMARC, DKIM, all the stuff we're going to talk about a little bit later. And they're trying to guess if the recipient is likely to mark this as spam or if they're likely to interact with the recipient. And they have all sorts of mechanisms to do this. Largely, they're doing some form of pattern matching. What is going on the internet that they can see in email land that might say this might be a low reputation or high reputation. Then the final step is the recipient, the actual person, the human being that receives this email decides if you're reputable or your company's reputable enough. So you've already passed through 2 levels of reputation judgment, and now the ultimate judge comes, which is, does the sender look reputable to me? Is there anything in this email that gives me pause and makes me like unsure if I should reply to it? Does this seem like a reputable company? Is this offer or this call to action reputable, or is it going to bring damage to me or my company? Is something bad going to happen? So all these things happen, and this all happens basically in just a few moments. There are 3 very strong layers of reputation. A lot of reputation management goes into making sure that this works properly. So I split these into 2 broad buckets, the technical reputation and non-technical. And your job as a cold email marketer is to do everything you can to improve both sides of this equation, which hopefully the advice in this presentation will help that happen. So here are the 4 elements of, there's 5. There's 6 now. There's 6 elements. I must have added more. There's 6 elements of technical reputation, which we're going to cover all of them. Domain IP standing, DNS records, which is what we're talking about with DMARC, DKIM, SPF, blacklist, block lists, data quality, your choice of provider, and finally ratios. And we'll jump straight in. So domain IP reputation. This is all going to be very dense, and I'm glad that it's going to be dense because hopefully this document can live on beyond this, and you guys can refer to this or send it around to your IT team or anyone else on your team that's trying to sort these things out. So hopefully this will be a useful resource moving forward. So low reputation senders burn domains quickly. And so they use new domains. And new domains can make you look like someone that doesn't have a high reputation. So it makes sense to always rely on aged domains, probably 30 days or more, and warm them up properly starting after they've been around for 30 days. This might be controversial. Some people say they should warm immediately. In our experience with across millions and millions of emails, usually it makes sense to use domains that are existing for a while and you've warmed them after they've existed for a while. And
Benny, can I ask you one question about that? Sorry to
Sure.
cut you off,
No, it's
but
okay.
to your point about new domains and waiting 30 days, I actually haven't heard about that. Um, my question is, let's say, I have a new SDR that joins.
Sure.
Should I begin warming that email address immediately, or also give it 30 days before warming that new email address?
So most of the reputation on the internet is based on a domain level, not on a sender level.
Gotcha.
So you should warm the new email address. You can start warming immediately, but in the case of a new domain, it does make sense to have a wait period. In the way that we do email for our clients, because we don't send any emails from Google and Microsoft at all, and we use totally separate email infrastructure, we don't even like domains that are 30 days old. We like them 60, 90 plus days
Yeah.
old. And then we use sending subdomains and things like that, which I can talk about in a second. But the whole idea is just domain age really matters, because the way that spammers have often operated is you just burn through domains. And
Gotcha.
you're just trying to build the best foundation for high reputation, if that makes sense.
Okay, and we have a couple questions as well, just around if you could explain what warming the domain means, just for people who don't know what warming a domain is.
Sure. Warming is a process where a bunch of senders unrelated to you opt into a pool to receive and send emails back and forth and treat your emails well. And what that does is the sort of stated purpose is to train email systems across the internet that you're a reputable sender and you shouldn't be going to spam. There are other benefits to it and other risks with this kind of thing, which I can go into more detail in the Q&A later if you'd like. But all in all, it's a mechanical set of emails back and forth that you use usually through providers. Mailshake has its own warming system, which I'm sure does exactly what it's supposed to do. And that's what I mean by warming. Now, that's the mechanical sort of automatic way to do warming. The non-mechanical or sort of old school way to do warming is you send emails back and forth amongst people you know, then you widen out to very, very high interest groups. So for example, if you were using the new domain and it was aged to a certain extent, and you had a whole bunch of prospects that maybe you hadn't talked to in a while, but they'd already expressed interest, maybe you could start by emailing them and you're sort of warming up the domain in a natural way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, great questions, guys. Keep them coming. We're going to cover as many questions as possible in the Q&A and throughout the show. But yeah, Benny, feel free to
all day. More
along.
questions, the merrier. I answer them all.
Yeah.
Rapid fire. No, I'm just kidding. So low reputation senders do other things like I talked about here, domain name and content match. So matching what you're doing, the domain with other elements of your business can be really important. For example, if you were trying to pretend to be someone, you might manipulate one of the letters. For example, if you were sending from if you were pretending to send from a bank, you might say like bankofamerica's.com to try to trick the recipient to not seeing that it's different. In the case of an alternate domain that you're creating and warming up, it actually makes sense to be very obvious with what's going on. Something like bankofamerica-email.com would probably be a smarter way to do it. And then actually accessing bankofamerica-email.com should forward to your domain, because what you're trying to do is prove to the recipient systems that are scanning these things that it's a different email, but it's coming from the same place, or it's like a very reputable place. So that it's one of the ways you can use domains. Low reputation senders don't have a sort of mismatch. There's something kind of amiss about the setup. The other thing is low reputation senders ignore black and block lists for the most part because they only care about things that affect their deliverability. You as a reputable sender want to be mindful of black and block lists and make sure that if you are on those, then you're heeding the warnings that they are showing you. And then spikes and rejects and bounces, you should be aware of this, because if you see a spike in bounces and you go, oh, I'll worry about that a couple of days from now, probably the problem is just going to get worse and not get better. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Is there?
Mhm.
I was going to ask, is there like a bounce rate that you would like if you see a certain bounce rate or a certain percentage increase in spike in bounces, is there like a number that you would say that's concerning, or does it just depend on everyone's situation?
Well, so situations do differ. There are different
Yeah.
kinds of bounces, and I'm not going to go into all the details of different kinds of bounces because it's a little bit
Yeah.
silly to do. But if you're sure that you're emailing people who have legitimate email addresses that are verified and it's bouncing, or you're getting actual reject emails back that are like, we cannot deliver your message because of some
Yeah.
reason, you very well might have a problem. Those also can be indicative of a issue with your SPF, DMARC, DKIM, that kind of area too, because certain email servers will give you feedback. The reason why you can't universally say this is the number that matters or doesn't matter is that a lot of the rejected emails come from larger companies, and
Gotcha.
they aren't necessarily sharing the fact that they rejected your email with the wider internet. If
Mm,
you're mainly emailing smaller companies that all use Google, you have a tool that we can talk about in a second called Google Postmaster, which actually just tells you what percentage of emails you've sent to Google users has bounced. So you don't even have to guess. You can just
oh wow.
log into Google Postmaster tool and look at the number. It's super easy to set up. It doesn't cost anything. It's just one of Google's free tools. And in fact, I think a lot of people here, well, I can only guess because of the sort of hubbub that's come in the last couple of days. Google has rolled out new rules around email spam reporting and ramifications of having too high of a bounce rate. And in uh, that scenario, they're talking about a 0.3% rate. Interestingly, and I think this is oftentimes being missed by people who are reporting on this, they're kind of seeing this as like a mysterious black box scenario, but they're
Yeah.
actually very, very specific. They say 0.3% or higher in Google Postmaster tool. So they're basically saying if you want to know if you're breaking the rule or not, go to Google Postmaster and look.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to set up Google Postmaster and monitor it between now and February and look at your domains that you're sending from and just ask yourself the question, how many days have I gone over 0.3%? What happened on those days? How can I keep that number lower? And then
Right.
lo and behold, if they do roll out a really draconian thing, which we don't know what they're actually going to do in February, but if they did that, you can confidently say, well, for the last 50 days of sending, only one of those days we went over 0.3%. And that's because Barbara dumped in all those emails into our systems that were
Yeah.
not like properly cleaned or something. And then you're like, well, now
Right.
we know the answer. Like we're always below that number. Or if you're always above it, you can start to take steps to bring it down, if that makes sense. Cool. The one thing I would say is that for all intents and purposes, subdomains are a really interesting way out of a lot of the domain issues. Why do I say that? Subdomains are where you put something underneath the domain like mail.southwest or .com or something. A lot of people think this is some sort of like funky hack, like, oh, a subdomain, like that's so artistic or like so unique. Like who invented that? It's actually really baked into the fabric of the internet. And if you're curious, if you go to your email inbox, like if you go right now and go to your own email inbox and you look at every transactional or every marketing email you get, especially from senders that send a lot of emails, you'll see that almost all of them are sending from subdomains. Email.largecompany.com, ilove.southwest.com, that kind of thing. And you'll see that only a very, very small number of companies and very, very small number of senders actually send from their main domain. And that's because it's really hard to maintain the reputation of a singular domain. And if you're using subdomains, you can warm them and age them and use them, but you can also switch them out and dispose of them. And you can even attach, as you can see in your inbox, email addresses to a subdomain. And as far as we can tell, the Google Postmaster tools are looking at subdomains differently from main domains. So that could be a
Gotcha.
way to widen out without doing a lot of domain buying and all those kinds of things, which can potentially cause other issues. Jimmy, I think you're probably going to need, if it's a subdomain email address, the MX records are going to be different. So you're going to have a separate set of MX records for that subdomain. If that makes sense. Let's see. If the domain has So open and click tracking doesn't necessarily cause more rejection and bounces, although there are instances where it can. The reasons why it can is especially if it's creating some sort of redirect, meaning when they click on something, it goes somewhere else, then goes to where it's going, because that makes it hard for the recipient email server to see through where the domain is. Like, for example, if you have systems set up where you can track clicks very carefully, what you oftentimes find is the larger the company, the more likely that a click is recorded. And that's because the email systems that are receiving emails are automatically clicking on every link and seeing what happens. So if they're clicking on links and there are lots of redirects, there's potential for someone to put malicious code inside the redirect. And that means that they could download spam without knowing it, or open some sort of pop-up behind the screen, like whatever silly stuff that people do or scary stuff that people do to like sort of disrupt systems. So the redirects are really the thing. If you are really concerned about who's clicking, and that's really important to your sales process and your own knowledge of how things are working, consider using something like a UTM parameter. UTMs sit after the domain. So it could be mailshake.com/?, and then has a code. I don't know if Google invented it or if Google bought the company that invented it or something like that. But these are basically fundamental to the way Google handles things. And they don't cause redirects, and they don't affect the kinds of code or whatever that loads on a page. So those could be a really easy way for you to track links without them if you are seeing that your deliverability suffers because of click tracking. Does that make sense? Okay, let's move on to the next slide. We'll circle back to more questions. So I don't want to belabor this point because everywhere you look on the internet, people basically all say the same thing. You got to set up SPF DMARC DKIM. You got to do it. These are text entries that sit in the back end of it, like your GoDaddy or your Namecheap or Google Domains or whatever, wherever you house your domain records. You need this kind of authentication no matter what domain you're sending from. You have to make sure they're set up properly. Don't copy and paste them from somewhere else. Be careful about whose advice you take on it. Make sure that you're kind of going from first principles and asking yourself, is this the right way to configure it? And then you can also get help with things like this. I think that the easiest way to think about what these things are is they're kind of like an ID system. So in other presentations, I've likened them to a passport. Everyone has passed a border. Everyone knows you need a passport to pass to the border. They kind of look at your thing, they look at your face, they confirm with your passport, they ask if anything's amiss, and then they'll let you through. And if something's amiss, then they'll reject it. This is pretty similar. And the reason is, and this is a little bit confusing, I think, for folks that are relatively new to email, spammers and hackers and all these sort of bad people that are making email harder to do for all of us legitimate business senders mess with a lot of stuff to make it seem like an email's legitimate. That's sort of like the sport that they play. They're trying to figure out how to make it so Google will deliver an email that looks like it came from your bank but didn't come from your bank. So all these systems are basically saying, well, if we add more ways to authenticate and more ways to authenticate, then we can sort of weed out these bad players. The other thing is on the new Google rules that if this is the first time you're hearing about it, you can Google it. Google made an announcement a few weeks ago that says that they're going to be tracking things at 0.3% and above on sending is going to more likely to not be delivered. And they've kind of freaked everyone out a little bit. A lot of the rules that they've said are about SPF, DMARC, and DKIM. They're basically saying we're not going to look kindly on you if you're trying to send and deliver emails without this verification.
Right.
This is basically important to that kind of thing. Make sure they have perfect syntax. The record types are all right. They really matter. They're only going to matter more. As I said, Google is basically making another case for doing these things and getting them set up. Does that make sense? So I mentioned this a little bit ago, or maybe I mentioned this on a pre-call on our secret chat before when Jed and I were talking. Blacklists and block lists are really interesting. It's not always clear that they directly affect deliverability, but they're a good warning sign that somebody on the internet is aware of you and you're sending and doesn't like it. They usually refresh after a certain number of days, weeks, or months. So if you stop sending from a domain that seems to be on blacklist, it ends up being removed from a blacklist sort of automatically. And there are ways that if these things are pervasive, you can appeal to them and be like, I swear I'm not a bad person. Largely, these blacklists and blocklists are either completely automated or they're run by open source means. So there are groups of people that maintain these, and only certain email service providers subscribe to or follow what these blacklists and blocklists say. So you should take it more as a warning sign, not as a death blow. And also you should be aware that your deliverability might really be having trouble and you might still be completely off of these lists. This one is pretty obvious, but always should be harped on again and again. Data quality matters for sending reputation. This plays into something I'm going to talk about in a second, which is ratio. As we talked about before, the 0.3% thing with Google, that's a ratio question. 3 out of 1,000 emails, if they're marked as spam, Google looks at you shaded or something. Data quality is another thing that hurts sending ratios because the internet can easily see if an email slides across the internet confidently trying to land in someone's inbox, and then the email server goes, well, there's no email address for that here, and sends it back. There are a lot of reasons why poor data quality hurts your deliverability. They're oftentimes not discussed in depth, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on the exact mechanics of what causes this, but I think one thing that is kind of interesting and exciting for those listening, potentially interesting and exciting, is that there is a form of spam that takes advantage of rejected emails. And I know this sounds kind of crazy and kind of clever, so I'm going to tell you the story because I think it's important for everyone to have a little bit of excitement in their day. Bounced emails, the actual email that comes back, has tremendously good deliverability, as you can imagine. Because if you send an email to someone and that email server rejects it and lets you know that it's being rejected, that reject email letting you know comes to your inbox. So spammers have figured out that that's the case, and they deliberately dump millions and millions of emails that are designed to bounce. However, they tell the internet that the email came from you. So the bounce comes to you. Does that make sense? So they go to the edge of the internet and go, I'm Jed, and I'm trying to send this email to blah, blah, blah. And then the email reject comes to Jed. And inside that bounce message, they've figured out ways to make it so Jed's like, I'm confused. Well, how did this happen? Let me investigate this. And through the investigation, you go to the websites that they want you to go to, basically.
Yeah, gotcha.
This is one of the ways that you might say, well, who cares if I get a lot of bounces? Like, how would that affect my deliverability? Well, one of the ways is it really matters to email service providers if someone's sending a lot of emails that bounce. It just matters because one of the forms of spam is leveraging bounced emails to make things, to deliver nefarious things. So the final thing I'll say is a lot of larger companies in particular have what are called accept all email addresses. And if you run your emails through email checking software, which you can do, unbounce and things like that, or not unbounce, sorry, million verifier systems like that, they're going to tell you which emails are bad, which are good, and then which ones are okay, maybe okay, not sure, unknown, accept all. It's important to understand what accept all emails are because they do present a sort of risk for sending. And oftentimes, if you feel like your deliverability is already suffering, sending to accept all will not help you. Imagine you're in a big office tower and there are 5,000 employees in it. Imagine you work in the mailroom and someone comes in with an envelope and says, this is for Jane Smith. It's addressed to Jane Smith. Most likely, you're not going to immediately check the database of who works there, try to figure out if this person works in the office somewhere else, is an employee, is not, used to be an employee, is an employee anymore, or which slot to put the mail in at the most likely chance of getting it to the right person. You'll accept it first and you'll sort it out later. That's what accept all emails basically are. They just say, well, first things first, we'll receive it. and then we'll sort it out later. So they don't give you an immediate bounce. They first accept it, then they decide to reject it. So that can create problems if you're sort of like, well, it says accept all, I'll give it a shot. And you're like, oh, look, it went through. And then lo and behold, 2 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 2 days later, it gets bounced back. The damage is still there. And oftentimes people turn old email addresses in their company into spam traps. So it can make sense to do a little bit of work on cleaning and understanding what the data quality looks like of your sending, and then that can ultimately help your deliverability.
Are there any list cleaning tools you recommend? We got a couple questions around, like, for example, Michael asked, should you be cleaning your list for valid emails every single time you send emails? I mean, my recommendation is yes, before you ever add to a sequence or whatever you're doing, clean that list. But some people have mentioned it could get expensive. Are there any tools that you recommend for that?
I always hesitate to recommend specific products. And the reason why I hesitate to recommend specific products is there's no real benefit of one versus another. The mechanics of what's happening with these things, in my opinion, there are false positives, there are false negatives, there's gray area in the middle. I've found that one solution that I think works well and is extremely inexpensive is Million Verifier. I'm not endorsing them in any way. I don't know anything about the ethics of the company. I don't know anything about what the company does or how they do what they do. And the reason why I'm giving this like big caveat is that there are lots of providers that do something similar. Some may be less expensive or more expensive, but on a pure mechanics level, I've always found that Million Verifier does exactly what it says it does, and it's extremely inexpensive. I literally think you can get millions of verifications for like a couple $100. So, but you can explore on your own. Maybe there are new tools that you find that are cheaper. Maybe someone lets you sample a product that you can get it for far cheaper. I don't know. I think that even if you're using a tool that is automatically verifying or says they're automatically verifying, you might find that your own personal risk tolerance is higher or lower than that tool. What do I mean by that? If a tool insists this is good to deliver and you're not paying for it, like let's say your CRM is automatically checking and letting you know. If you take that same list and you download it, let's say before you put it into Mailshake or wherever you're sending from, and you do your own Million Verifier check, you might find that they said some will be delivered that the system you're using says won't, et cetera, like back and forth. You might be, it's so confusing. The reason why it's confusing is each one of these tools is sort of using their own weighting mechanism. And when you download the full report, you can see all the different types of verification they're doing. And then they're making a determination if it's good, bad, accept all. So the reason why I'm saying that, and again, this is a little bit in depth, and I'm sorry for those who already fell asleep hearing me talk about email verification. It's as you become a more sophisticated emailer, you will find some tools you trust more than others, and they might be slightly more expensive. And some types of markets have very stable deliverability. For example, founders of smaller companies tend to be pretty stable. They don't have a high bounce rate. So you might be able to verify that list once every 3 or 4 or 5 months and have almost no issues and problems. While if you're emailing HR directors, they might have a lot of churn. I don't know if they do. I'm just saying they might have a lot of churn. So maybe you want to have a really inexpensive verifying system you verify all the time. Maybe you're emailing to very large companies where there's tons of accept all, and you need to take that into account as you do your emailing, because you might say, look, I don't even have a total addressable market if I can't email to accept all.
Yeah.
So playing with different tools, experimenting, and then looking through your own email through that lens and sort of using your own judgment might come into play.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So choice of providers really matters. For example, right now we feel like Google is clamping down, but Microsoft clamps down its own way. So who is your email provider and what rules do they have? And are you doing your best to follow their rules? In the case of Google and Microsoft, they're very clear that they don't like you doing cold email from them, but they're also very unclear about what the tolerances are. And we all know, Jed knows this, and most of the people on this call know this. If you are working with domains that are very, very old, who have had a Google account or Microsoft account for a long time, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, usually you can send a lot more emails. And if it's a new one, you can't. Or if it like it seems totally random, but it's good to be aware if you are doing something totally wrong or bad, if you're doing something totally in the clear, or if you're in the gray, and what the sort of grayness of it is. The sad truth about cold email is that it's sort of a gray thing. The internet doesn't really want you doing too much of it, but on a legal basis, I'm not a lawyer, but if you look at the actual spam laws in the United States, it states pretty clearly that if you follow the guidelines of the Federal Trade Commission, of which they have published guidelines on business email, it's allowed. So you're in this kind of interesting gray area. So it makes sense to just be aware of all the rules and restrictions in the email systems that you are using. And those can usually be found in terms of service or whatever, or acceptable use policies or whatever you're doing. So I made this very, very simple diagram. It's a pretty dumb diagram, but it does what it's supposed to. You have the person up top. Mailshake is sitting there in the middle. This could be another email system if that's what you're using, but you're on a Mailshake webinar, so maybe you're a Mailshake user. Mailshake isn't sending your emails. This is something that I hear a lot from folks. They say things like, oh, this system hurt my deliverability. And you're like, oh, really? Is that really the case? It's sort of like going to a different pharmacy and expecting the medicine to work differently. You're like, oh, when I got Advil from that pharmacy, it worked really well, but Advil from that pharmacy didn't. And you're like, there's some world in which they have better quality Advil, but I highly doubt it. So looking at this chart, what you see is the infrastructure comes into play after you've set things up and queued it up into, let's say, Mailshake, not based on what Mailshake does or doesn't do. Most people on this call probably are sending from Outlook or Google Mail. And if you're a bit more advanced, maybe you set up a custom SMTP type thing. In the case of my company, we don't send from Google or Outlook. We use a totally separate infrastructure, and we're comfortable with that. It requires a lot of maintenance to do that. So I'd understand if people are leaning more towards using Google and Outlook. Wherever you're sending, you don't want to abuse the infrastructure, because that's basically what low reputation senders do. So if you're trying to do things to slide, or sort of like slide under the rules, you should at least be fully aware that you're doing shady things to slide under the rules, and that might make you look like a low reputation sender, if that makes sense. Cool. Ratios. What are we talking about when we talk about ratios? It's a very simple equation with 3 factors. Are enough emails being sent out with enough variation across enough properly warmed and prepped domains that you can manage your ratio of sends? And when I say ratio, I'm talking about reputation affirming signal. Were they opened, interacted, clicked, replied, or reputation negative signal, like never opened, never clicked, never replied, marked as spam? The Google rules that we recently talked about, or we talked about Google's recent rules that we talked about a little bit ago, are likely about this, the ratio. So they're basically saying, hey, if you're going to email Google users, that's great. However, make sure that no more than 3 out of 1,000 of those emails gets marked as spam, please. That's entirely a ratio question. So it's yet another thing that you need to think about with your ratios. There was a question earlier about warming. Warming is actually very interesting because warming directly affects your sending ratios. So this might be part of the reason why Google did a clampdown on email warming software, which you can read about if this is news to you. Likely because it affects the sending ratios, and they're using the sending ratio as a way to measure if they want to punish you or not. And warming actually very effectively changes your sending ratio. What I mean by that is, imagine you're sending 100 emails a day, prospecting emails. It's going pretty well. You're getting interested replies. But even in a really great scenario, you're getting 50% opens. Well, the ratio completely changes if you have 100 prospecting emails and 100 warming emails. Now there's 200 emails. Your blended open rate is now 75%. So that's a very positive reputation signal that you've introduced. So it makes sense that systems like Google, like warming's bad. We're not sure what them thinking it's bad is going to result in, but we are sure that if you are sending emails, they are affecting your ratio, and Google is very concerned with your sending ratio. Therefore, if you're able to improve your ratio, you can improve your deliverability, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Cool. So let's get into non-technical stuff. This is really Jed's category. Like, Jed knows this stuff better than anyone. So I'm going to give my little take on it, and I'm going to move through this part pretty quickly because I don't want to harp too much on it. How your target perceives your company's reputation matters. How your email text reinforces your reputation matters. And the reputation of you or whoever it is that's actually sending the emails really matters. So don't overlook the fact that people, before they reply with interest, oftentimes they do a little bit of digging to make sure that you're reputable.
Yeah.
You know, people that don't do cold email consistently or ever are baffled, like, how cold email never works. How could you build a pipeline with cold email? Like, I get cold emails all day and they're all terrible. What most of those people don't tell you is that 1 out of every 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 actually intrigues them enough to reply. And they literally do the thing that you know, people do, which is like, oh, but this one's different.
Yeah.
And an example of that would be a founder of a company that never replies to a cold email ever, but they get an email from, uh, you know, Sequoia Capital, who might be interested in the next round, and magically they're interested and they reply, wow, thanks so much for the email. Why? Because the reputation of the sender is so high that they're willing to go against their hard and fast rule of never replying to a cold email for that one email. So what you should sort of strive to do is always think about yourself in the context of, how can I present as very reputable? So I become the one email out of dozens that day or that week or whatever, where they actually do reply to. And sometimes that reputation can be built outside of the email, but also, of course, it can be built, you know, inside the email. So like, what is the email text you're saying? I like to say that folks don't really read cold emails as look at them. So you have to be very, very clear. If they're having trouble figuring out what it is you do, it's hard for them to build their idea of you being high reputation in the while they're reading the email, if that makes sense. So the other thing is, it's a little bit hard for folks to understand how little context comes through in a cold email. I think, and Jed, you might disagree, but I always feel like we're taught in some way to lead with the why. And that's really makes sense on a human level. But in cold emails, if you don't really lead with the what, you confuse people. What do I mean by that? If you're a SaaS solution that does something, you should just be like, we're a SaaS solution that does X. It takes them 5 seconds, not even a fraction of a second to read that. And then the context of the why starts to make a lot of sense to them. I get a lot of cold emails, and I'm sure you do too, Jed, where I read them quite carefully because I'm always curious, and I'm always a little like, is this what is this?
I think my perspective on it too is that there's been a large trend over the last few years of like trying to make your email as short and short and short as possible, and so as a result, people are leaving out a lot of like helpful context that should be included in your email. I completely agree. Long emails, short emails doesn't really matter either way, as long as a few things are clear. You've showed them, you've known them, you know them in some way or form, which is typically in that first line. You've clearly described how you help and what you do, which to your point is super important that people kind of like hint at or they don't fully describe. And you have a relevant offer, right? Like when you mentioned, Benny, the Sequoia email, why do they respond? Yes, the reputation, but also because the offer is great, right? Like that's something interesting. So that's another thing to think about is like, how are you positioning your offer? Are you just positioning it as, hey, let's jump on a demo, or do you have some sort of value to give in that email? I know that's beyond the topic of this call, but
No,
you
I
know
think,
that
but I
it's
think that
worth
really, it
mentioning.
really matters because we're all talking about ratios. So
Yeah.
keep in mind, and this is something that gets manipulated by certain kinds of folks, and I'm not advocating for doing manipulation, but it's really gratifying as a cold emailer when you get really thoughtful no's.
Yeah.
If your email is so clear and gives them enough information that when they reply with, I get, I do cold emailing for my own company, sometimes more than others, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. But when I get email replies that say something like, "Thanks for the note, Benny. We actually were doing a lot of cold email last quarter, but we ended up rolling back and doubling down on inbound marketing. And we've had our team, we've shifted our entire SDR team to just dealing with inbound leads. But thank you." I feel good. I'm like, I connected with them. They gave me a straight answer as to why. To me,
Yeah.
that's a mark of a reputation, an email that's reputable enough for them to reply to. That's as opposed to emails I get that say, as an agency owner, this comes to my third point, avoid coming off as judging or guessing. You know, I bet you really struggle with lead gen. And to be honest, that's not a problem that we struggle with. That's not a core problem that I'm looking for a solution for. They might actually have a really excellent ad management tool or something that they're doing that might be beneficial to us, but they've already sort of pinpointed this one thing that they're like judging me for having low lead volume, which happens to be something I don't have. So I'm obviously not going to reply because it's very
Yeah.
difficult for someone to overcome something in an email that they feel is factually inaccurate, because I can't just reply with, "Sure, send it over." I have to be like, "Actually, lead volume isn't something that I'm super concerned with, but I am interested." It's like, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So oftentimes I find that like avoiding coming off as judgmental or guessing helps. And you can build credibility and your reputability in this email through other ways. You can make it a little bit different. Like, a lot of the founders we talk with have these particular struggles, and I'm not sure if you do, but our solution can help either way. Like, actually, sort of, in my view, at least, comes off with it comes off as a way to build reputation more than just someone guessing at my particular pain point of the day or week.
Right.
Not maybe people listening in have done really well with pinpointing struggles of particular people and it works well. And hats off to you if you figured it out. Certainly, as Jed said, long emails, short emails, both have worked. Complex emails, simple emails, both have worked. Leading with the why, leading with how, like, all these things can all work in their own way, and every market's different. Certainly, if you've done cold email or looked into cold email as much as Jed and I have, you start to really believe that you've seen almost every single pattern work. It's like kind of wild. These are just my feelings about purely on the reputation side, things to consider. Let's see. So, the final one I mentioned is the sender itself. For a while, it was kind of trendy to make up fake senders. I don't think this is a good idea for two reasons. One, it actually goes against what it says in the CAN spam law, which might be contributing to your emails going to spam. We don't know how sophisticated Google's systems are, but if they sense that it's not a real person that's sending, or the person that's sending doesn't match up with a real person, it can hurt deliverability. I'm not going to say that as a hard and fast rule. That's not something that I know or very many people would know. But I think the reputation of the person can really help. So if you are confident with your LinkedIn presence, if you're a real person, if you reference yourself, make references to yourself and your own reputability, it can definitely help. We've seen cold emails go out that, wow, I think we hit the room size capacity.
Yeah, we did.
Damn, we're rocking it. Sorry, everyone waiting in the waiting room. Everyone in, like, now we're a special group. Like, this is totally special for us now.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to wait outside. What I was going to say is we've seen instances where folks were really not that interested in the product or the value prop, but they were really interested in the person. They'd say, "Wow, your background seems super interesting. I'm not sure if we're in the market for blah, but I'd love the chance to chat with you." And that really is, no, we're not talking about celebrities doing emails. We're talking about someone that has an expertise or whatever. Like, if you were a graphic designer and you just built B2B ads for, a company, and you said, we focus on B2B ads, they might say, "Look, we think we're pretty covered with our B2B ads, but I'd love to pick your brain and get your opinion on what we're working on and see if there's a way to work together down the road." In my view, that's almost entirely based on the reputation that the actual sender presented, either in the email or outside the email, and that can really affect your deliverability and all the other success metrics. So that's everything I prepared for today, and then we can jump into the Q&A. To recap, we split reputation into two broad categories: technical stuff we went over, and non-technical stuff, which we went over very briefly. I would say in closing, your job as a cold email marketer is to just do everything you can to improve both sides of your reputation. And that's probably your surest path to continued success. And I think that's it. Should we jump into the
Yeah.
Q&A, or do you have any points you want to add before we?
Let's jump into the Q&A. There was a lot of good questions that came through. So I'm going to scroll all the way back up to the top, and Bennett, we can knock these out. We got 10 minutes. I think we covered some of them throughout the webinar, but let's just jump into the first one. So Josh is an SDR leader. He mentioned, how do you direct sales/marketing ops departments to show them that the tech stack is having problems? In their case, it's SalesLoft when it comes to email deliverability. I look at the activity and see they're sending fewer, more relevant emails, but deliverability still seems to be a problem.
Okay, so first of all, as an SDR leader, oftentimes we find slightly younger people in SDR and SDR leadership positions, which means they don't feel like they have the voice of the people inside the org. So part of this might be purely a social thing. I'm older, much older than Jed, and I don't know how old I look on camera, but I'm getting close to 40. So in my experience, most of the people that you're reporting into are around my age. So I'm going to speak this answer from the perspective that I'm older than you, although I understand that I might not be older than you. Oftentimes, folks respect a process, an audit. They respect a junior person or a person in a junior position that says, we think there might be a problem, and I am going to launch a process in order to investigate a solution for this, or understanding if there is a problem. The reason why that's relevant is that oftentimes my team is not brought in not on a paid position, but we're brought in potentially to solve the problem, and we're actually participating in an SDR leader's process. So what they say is they set up a meeting with me and they go, Benny, tell us your solution and tell us what you do in this scenario. And I am, Mr. Sales Guy. I'm like, this is what we do. And and they go, great. I don't know if my company's ready to buy from you at all, but I'd like to set up another call with my leadership team or my technical folks to learn more about what you do. So they're basically running a process, and they're bringing in an expert, in this case, me and my team, to sort of walk them through it. I get a shot at pitching, which I like. Sometimes we win, but I also give advice in this process. Sometimes it actually leads to a very clear punch list of things that your team decides to pay us for, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it leads to your team questioning your use of this tool or that tool or whatever. Sometimes it doesn't. But I think that largely you will benefit inside your company by announcing that you're going to be running an investigation, a process, and making a Google Doc that says, here's the 3 steps. 1, I'm going to write up a little paragraph what we think is happening. 2, I'm going to source information from 2 or 3 experts and do calls with them to ask them their opinion. 3rd thing, I'm going to loop in the technical team on this. 4th thing, we're going to talk about solutions. It's much easier to get folks in your team to start to say, okay, maybe it's worth investing in the technical side before we start to blame people on the team for winning, losing, succeeding, not succeeding. A lot of times leadership doesn't really understand seasonality and sort of subtle changes in the market as much as an SDR does. It's sort of like if you ever worked in retail or something like that, it would almost be like a regional manager not understanding why sales sucked on Saturday. And then you're like, well, it's because it was a marathon day and no one could even get to our storefront. Like, they don't know what's going on in the ground. So you're sort of running a process to try to prove that you're weeding out the things that obviously would be inhibiting it, but also bringing to light things that might. Sorry, that was a very long answer, and we have a lot of questions to get through, so I'm sorry.
No, you're good. It was a good question, good answer. So yeah, we got to go out. So we'll just rapid fire the rest of these. So from Scott, he's a marketing guy. He says, do the new rules apply to marketing email send? I assume Scott's referring to like the 0.3%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, straight as that. Email is email.
There's a very. This is a little bit. You need to tell me if you want me to go into too much detail on this. It does affect marketing emails. If you have an IT team, you should let them know that if they're emailing from their main domain or a domain, there's a lot of emails centered in one domain, like for marketing, they should probably consider rolling out a subdomain, creating more protection and more room in their sending. So that way,
Yep.
your marketing emails don't affect your cold emails, and your marketing emails don't affect your transactional emails like password resets and things like that, if that's the type of company you are. So really taking a look at your domain and what domains you're using could help make sure that you're not walking yourself into it. And then also go Google Postmaster tools for investigating the rates that Google's already measuring.
That one's super cool. I'm glad you mentioned that earlier too. I haven't heard of it. Cool. So another question from Colton. He says email open rates are usually 30% or lower, but on the spam test, it appears that our domain is fine. What's the next step here?
I think that you can always be testing more on open rates. The tools like Lavender, which I don't endorse or they don't pay me or anything, but tools like Lavender can really help you understand what kinds of things are working better. Oftentimes marketers get involved and they want to do long subject lines that sort of look like they give value or something. But Jed, I think you've spoken about this before. Oftentimes 2-word subject lines, all lowercase with no pluralization, work the best. So if you're a analytics tool, if you just write analytics tool, like lo and behold, your open rates are better because it sort of primes someone to be like, analytics tool, okay, I'll have a look. Or if you're a payment processor, you just write payment processing. And then people, so I think like you can overthink it, but oftentimes just more experimentation can be the difference. And then of course there are instances where your open rates are lower because your target market is really, really hard to reach.
Yeah,
that's
another part to it. Yeah. Cool. So question from Ryan: if reputation is at the domain level rather than the user level, how do I pick apart the causes of up to a 40% disparity in open rate between two people who started emailing at the same time? I've seen this issue too. You got one SDR has got a really high open rate, one that's had a low open rate. Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
This sounds funny, but systems like Google really care where emails are coming from. Oftentimes you'll see a disparity purely because one's in the United States of America where the headquarters is based and the other one's in Northern Europe or something. And it's just like, well, there's the difference. We've seen instances where someone has a particular name that might be like PJ or something. And the systems might be like, this looks weird. I'm not going to be delivering this. The other one could be other differences in email patterns. I would say that the way to definitively check this is by spinning up a new domain, letting it sit for a while, and then attempting a new domain with the same kind of thing, or even swapping audiences and seeing if that can affect it. We have seen very interesting disparate email situations in a similar way. Oftentimes, it's not because it's the same target market, it's a slightly different market, and the different market has different reactions to the same person. But also keep in mind, we're assuming that there aren't any domain other underlying issues at play, which sometimes there are.
Gotcha. So, all right, we got time for a couple more questions. Another one, you mentioned using different email infrastructures. How does that work? Is that something custom built in-house or a separate service other than Google or Outlook?
I don't want to go into too much detail on this. And the reason I don't want to is that Mailshake itself, if you're a Mailshake user, does not recommend you use other services. In my experience in my company, we found great success in using external IP pools. So SMTP relay services that aren't Google or Microsoft. It's a service that we charge for. We charge relatively significantly for, and we mainly do it for late seed to Series B size companies. And the reason why I say that is that in order to do cold email from these systems, it's actually quite a lot of work to maintain them. Sometimes you get lucky and it doesn't require a lot of work, but it takes quite a lot of work to maintain them. The term for it is usually SMTP relay. So if you're going to Google that and dig into it, that's the sort of route that you should go. And if you really want to dig into this very deeply, you feel free to send me a note, benny@senders.co, or reach out to me on LinkedIn or schedule a call with me, and I'm happy to walk you through all the ins and outs of that kind of thing.
Yeah,
that goes
for sure.
anyone on this call as well.
Yeah, I mean, so Benny, we've got a lot of questions here that unfortunately we're not going to be able to answer because we're coming up on time.
Do you want to bring them all together and post them on your LinkedIn, and then I can just go through and answer in the comments?
Yeah, let's do it. Benny and I were going to do some collaborative content anyway. So first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who joined because it was honestly a lot of people, a lot more than we initially expected. So we really appreciate that. Also, thank you to Benny for the awesome presentation. Every single question in here that we didn't answer, we're going to get the transcript. I'll communicate with Benny and we'll answer that live on LinkedIn as well. We'll just throw up a post or a video. So thank you. If you have any additional questions, message Benny or myself on LinkedIn, and we're going to get all these questions answered. Thanks so much to everyone who joined. Benny, anything else you want to add before we jump off?
No, but I want to answer every single one of your questions. So don't hesitate. We can do it in the comments in Jed's profile or my profile or whatever, but it's really important to me that you answer all the questions, and I only see good questions. So please don't let this end your curiosity for email sending and delivery, and hopefully Jed and I can add a whole bunch of value and answer a bunch of questions.
Yeah, if you get those questions to us today, then we'll be able to answer them by tomorrow in that post. So yeah, good stuff. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you around. And I'm gonna make that post tomorrow as well.
Cool, guys. Talk soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jed. I appreciate it.
Of course.